The film begins with introducing a former special agent named Bryan, who now lives alone because his only daughter, Kim, lives with his ex-wife. One day, Bryan attends his daughter's 17th birthday party and meets his ex-wife, Lenore. Shortly after, Kim arrives at the party and Bryan immediately gives Kim a karaoke machine as a gift because he knows she loves to sing. However, a man suddenly arrives with a horse as a birthday gift for Kim, and he is Kim's stepfather, who is currently Lenore's husband. Seeing this, Bryan looks a bit disappointed because Kim prefers the gift from her stepfather, while his gift is left unattended. However, this does not diminish his love for Kim in the slightest. That night, Bryan was looking at a photo of his daughter and realized how much she had grown, now 17 years old. Suddenly, his friends arrived to celebrate Kim's birthday at Bryan's house. When they were leaving, one of his friends, named Sam, offered Bryan a job as a bodyguard for a famous singer. Since he was unemployed at the time, Bryan gladly accepted the offer. Not long after, Bryan and his friends start working as bodyguards for a famous singer named Shira. At that moment, Shira is doing vocal warm-ups and getting her makeup done, which impressed Bryan with her voice. As Shira is heading to the stage, Bryan asks her for advice for his daughter, who also wants to become a famous singer. Hearing this, Shira simply responds that his daughter should practice a lot. Sometime later, while waiting for the concert to end, Bryan and his friends were seen relaxing and playing cards. Suddenly, he received a call from Kim, inviting him to lunch at a cafe the next day. Hearing this made Bryan very happy, and he eagerly looked forward to their meeting. However, after the concert, there is a riot caused by Shira's fans, who forcefully try to enter by breaking through the fence. As Bryan tries to escort Shira to the car, a hater attempts to stab her, but Bryan successfully protects Shira. Grateful for Bryan's help, Shira gives him her business card and offers free vocal lessons for his daughter, taught by herself. The next day, Bryan is already at the cafe, waiting to have lunch with Kim. Shortly after, Kim finally arrived also brings Lenore. Apparently, the main reason Kim is there is to ask for her father's permission because she plans to go to Paris with her friend Amanda and she needs Bryan's signature as a parent since she is not yet 18 years old. However, Bryan, aware of the harsh realities and dangers of the outside world, refused to sign the parental consent form. This decision clashed with Lenore's view that Bryan was being too controlling over their daughter's wishes. At the same time, Kim immediately left the place, upset by her father's decision. The next day, Bryan, not wanting his daughter to be sad, finally relented and signed the permission slip, but on the condition that Kim had to keep her phone on so he could check on her. Sometime later, when Bryan took Kim to the airport, he accidentally discovered that Kim was not only going to visit Paris but also planned to attend a music tour across Europe. Apparently, Lenore already knew this but had deliberately told her daughter to lie to Bryan because she knew that her father was too overprotective. Not wanting to disappoint his daughter, Bryan still let Kim go with her friend Amanda. Upon arriving in Paris, Kim and Amanda met a local young man named Peter, who was very friendly and even agreed to take their picture. Moreover, Peter also shared a taxi with them because their destination happened to be the same as his. Upon arriving at the hotel, Peter said goodbye to them. After that, Kim and Amanda went inside and they turned the music up loud, which caused Kim to miss several phone calls from Bryan. When Kim finally noticed her father was calling, she went to the next room to answer. She then reassured him that she was fine, but at that moment, several mysterious men entered and subdued Amanda and terrified Kim upon seeing this. Realizing his daughter was in danger, Bryan tried to stay calm and recorded the entire conversation because he knew Kim would still be kidnapped. Bryan then instructed Kim to get under the bed and to shout out descriptions of the people who were going to capture her. As Kim was being taken, she screamed that her captors included a man with a mustache, about 6 feet tall, with a crescent moon and star tattoo on his hand. When the kidnappers picked up Kim's phone, Bryan told them that he did not know who they were, but he would find them and kill them without mercy. The kidnapper then responded with, "Good luck." After that, Bryan immediately rushed to Lenore's house, and during the journey he contacted his friend Sam, sending him the recorded conversation to help identify the perpetrators. Upon arriving at Lenore's house, Bryan went straight to Kim's room to look for clues. While there, Sam called back, informing him that the people who had kidnapped Kim were part of a human trafficking syndicate, where the victims would be drugged and sold as commodities for profit. The person matching the description Kim provided was named Marco, and if she was not rescued within 96 hours, she would likely never return. Hearing this, Lenore immediately regretted letting their daughter go, while Bryan decided to head to Paris without delay. Upon arriving in Paris, Bryan went straight to the location where Kim was abducted. He then tried to think clearly, analyzing and simulating the incident. At that moment, Bryan found Kim's phone, which had been destroyed by the kidnappers, and he took the memory card to look for clues. Upon inspection, Bryan found a photo of Peter reflected in the glass while taking a picture of Amanda and Kim at the band. Immediately, Bryan rushed to the airport to find Peter, suspecting that he was part of the criminal gang. His speculation turned out to be true because Peter was acting as bait to locate and determine where the victims were staying. Not long after, Bryan successfully finds Peter and immediately asks where Kim and Amanda are. Unfortunately, a friend of Peter's tries to help him, allowing Peter to escape. After subduing Peter's friend, Bryan chases after Peter, who tries to flee but is hit by a car, eliminating his only lead. Confused, Bryan turns to an old friend named Jean, a French special agent currently working for the Paris Police Department. After a lengthy conversation, Jean informs Bryan that the people he is after are part of a dangerous Albanian criminal gang. At that time, Jean, who was also aware of Bryan's history of frequently dealing with criminals, asked him not to cause trouble in Paris and to leave the case to him. However, Bryan was determined to do whatever it took to save his beloved daughter. With a bit of information from Jean, Bryan goes to a location disguised as a buyer of women. As Bryan checks behind each curtain, he accidentally finds Kim's jacket and he immediately asks the woman there where she got Kim's jacket. Before the woman could answer, the criminals there suddenly realize that Bryan is an intruder, leading to a confrontation. Knowing this, Bryan decided to take the woman with him, hoping she has clues about Kim. Not long after, in an apartment, Bryan tries to help the woman recover from the effects of the drugs given by the criminals. At the same time, Jean, knowing that Bryan has caused trouble, demands that he turn himself in and offers to escort him to the airport to return to America. However, Bryan refuses since his daughter has not been rescued yet. Sometime later, the woman regains consciousness and Bryan immediately asks her how she came to have Kim's jacket. The woman then tells him that she got the jacket from a very kind woman and provides Bryan with some information that the police are involved. Based on the information, Bryan went to a certain location and posed as one of Jean's subordinates. It turned out that the criminal group regularly paid protection money to the local police, and Bryan pretended to be a police representative aiming to increase the protection fee. He then continues his investigation, searching for a man named Marco among them. However, they all claim to be named Marco. Bryan, suspecting one of the men based on the description given by Kim, asked him to say "good luck" in Albanian. After the man spoke the phrase, Bryan immediately realized that the man in front of him was the same one who had spoken to him on the phone. This led to a shootout, and Bryan managed to eliminate all of them. After eliminating everyone there, Bryan checks each room to look for Kim. Unfortunately, he finds Amanda, who is already dead from an overdose. After that, Bryan takes the suspected man for interrogation. Bryan then tortures the man with electric shocks, demanding to know where Kim is. Unable to withstand the torture, the man immediately reveals a name, St. Clair, as their boss. Because Kim is still a virgin, she was given to St. Clair. Unfortunately, the man does not know where he is now. Having gathered enough information, Bryan heads to Jean to ask who St. Clair is. Upon arrival, Jean suddenly points a gun at Bryan, demanding that he surrender. However, the gun is empty because Bryan had removed the bullets before their dinner began. Despite Jean's refusal to reveal who St. Clair is, Bryan is forced to shoot Jean's wife in the arm. Fearing for his family's safety, Jean finally agrees to give Bryan information about St. Clair. After obtaining detailed information, Bryan hurried to St. Clair's residence, disguised as one of the guests. Upon entering a room, he discovered that the place was an auction hall for selling selected girls to wealthy individuals. As several girls were paraded, Bryan was shocked to see that one of them was his beloved daughter, Kim, and he immediately pointed a gun at one of the attendees to buy Kim. As Bryan escorted the man to meet Kim, suddenly St. Clair's men attacked him, knocking him unconscious. When Bryan regained consciousness, he found himself tied and hung from a pipe by St. Clair. At that moment, St. Clair explained that all of this was just a unique business and ordered his men to kill Bryan without causing a commotion, as they had many guests. Fortunately, Bryan managed to free himself and fight back. After subduing them, Bryan demanded to know where his daughter was. At that moment, St. Clair, who had been shot several times, finally revealed that Kim was being taken by ship to the Middle East. Knowing this, Bryan quickly pursued the ship after stealing a car to reach the harbor. Once there, Bryan infiltrated the ship and eliminated all the guards. Using his skills as a former top agent, Bryan easily overcame them. Eventually, he found Kim, who was being held hostage by an older man. Without hesitation, Bryan immediately killed the man. After that, Kim cried and embraced her father, realizing that disobeying a caring father was not right. Upon returning to America, Kim was warmly welcomed by Lenore and her stepfather. At that moment, Lenore was deeply grateful to Bryan for saving Kim. A week later, a group of families were seen burying the bodies of those killed by Bryan. At that moment, an old man named Murad, the leader of the Albanian mafia, ordered his men to avenge their deaths. Elsewhere, Bryan visited his Lenore's house to see his daughter, as they had planned a driving lesson. Upon arrival, he only found Lenore, who informed him that Kim was at her boyfriend's house. Lenore then asked Bryan not to track and spy on them, as he had become increasingly overprotective since the kidnapping in Paris. However, Kim, who was with her boyfriend Jamie, was surprised by a visit from Bryan, who asked Jamie to hand over his daughter for the driving lesson. Unable to refuse, Kim decided to go with her father. During the drive, Kim expressed her frustration over her father's overprotective behavior. After dropping Kim off, Bryan asked his friend Sam to investigate Jamie's background. Sam, who worked for a security agency with access to police data, agreed to help. The scene then shifted to Paris, where Murad's men were torturing Jean. They demanded to know who had killed their family and threatened to harm Jean's family if he did not reveal the person's identity. The next day, Bryan returned to Lenore's house to meet Kim, and he found Lenore in a bad mood after arguing with her new husband, who had become abusive. Feeling sympathetic, Bryan invited Lenore and Kim to join him on a trip to Istanbul, where he had a security job for a few days. However, Lenore declined, not wanting to interfere with his work. At the same time, Murad's mafia also learned that Bryan would be in Istanbul for a few days. After a few days of work, Bryan finished his job and earned a decent amount of money. Unexpectedly, Lenore and Kim arrived in Turkey to join him for a holiday, where Bryan was delighted by their visit. Meanwhile, Murad and his men finally crossed into Turkey to hunt for Bryan, while he and his family enjoyed sightseeing and having fun. The next day, Murad's men were already at the hotel where Bryan and his family were staying. However, Bryan, always on alert, became suspicious of one of the people in the hotel lobby but decided to focus on his family instead. Feeling tired, Kim chose to relax in the hotel pool while Bryan and Lenore went for a walk together. It turned out that Kim did this in the hope of rekindling her parents' relationship. During their walk, Bryan realized they were being followed by a group of people. He then instructed Lenore to get off the street and return to the hotel to pick up Kim and take her to the American embassy for safety, while Bryan tried to divert the pursuers to keep his family out of danger. Unfortunately, Bryan's car was eventually cornered by the pursuer, and when the mafia members opened Bryan's car door, he had already escaped. However, Bryan still had to fight the mafia members until he managed to incapacitate several of Murad's men, but Lenore was captured. Realizing that both he and Lenore would be kidnapped, Bryan immediately called Kim, instructing her to hide in his hotel room closet, as she would likely be their next target. After surrendering, Bryan was beaten and taken along with Lenore to meet their leader, Murad. Meanwhile, despite being subdued with his head covered, Bryan remained focused, counting the distance traveled and analyzing his surroundings through sound. At the same time, Kim, aware that she might be kidnapped, tried to hide in her father's room closet. Not long after, Bryan was held in an empty warehouse with a guard stationed outside. He then took out a special communication device hidden in his sock, a standard tool for a special agent. Bryan contacted Kim and instructed her to go to the embassy for safety, but she refused, asking for a chance to rescue her parents. Knowing this, Bryan then instructed Kim to retrieve a map from his suitcase and draw a circle to locate where he was being held. He then told Kim to throw a grenade from his suitcase to mark the location. After analyzing the situation, Bryan ordered Kim to leave and move closer to his location. At that moment, Murad, the mafia boss, entered and he reminded Bryan of the man he electrocuted, revealing it was his son. Murad then promised that Bryan would now experience the pain he felt. After that, Lenore was tortured and left hanging to bleed out within 30 minutes, intending to make Bryan suffer before killing him. After they left, Bryan tried to free himself. Luckily, the restraints were made of nylon, not metal, allowing him to break free easily and untied Lenore. Meanwhile, Kim was near the location where her father was held. Reconnecting with Bryan, she followed his instruction to create another signal by detonating a grenade. Realizing that Kim was close, Bryan created smoke to indicate their location, and Kim threw a gun into the room upon finding the location. After that, Bryan and Lenore held their position as Bryan began to eliminate Murad's men one by one using his special forces tactics. On the other hand, Kim was being chased by Murad's men after they spotted her. Eventually, Kim got cornered. Just as she was about to be attacked, Bryan arrived and saved her. They then tried to rescue Lenore, but she had already been taken by Murad's gang, which resulting in a fierce chase. Despite still learning to drive, Kim managed to force one of the pursuing cars off the road, and she also outwitted another car that was still following her. After that, they drove into the American embassy, and Bryan tried to contact Sam to call his acquaintance at the embassy. Feeling that Kim was now safe, Bryan told her that he would return to rescue Lenore. Bryan then tried to analyze the situation by recalling the details from when he was first kidnapped. Meanwhile, Lenore was being intimidated by Murad, as his men were preparing torture instruments for her. At the same time, Bryan was determined to find Lenore, using everything he remembered hearing while in the car when they were kidnapped. Finally, Bryan found the place and eliminated the guards outside. He then subdued the people inside, making Murad realize that Bryan had arrived. Murad then planned to move Lenore to another location. However, Bryan continued to fight Murad's men, determined to save Lenore. Bryan also faced Murad's formidable right-hand man, who managed to corner him. However, his superior skills allowed him to defeat the man. Afterward, Bryan confronted Murad and was initially willing to forgive him, as he reasoned that killing Murad would only incite more revenge from his followers. Bryan then offered Murad a chance to live by placing his gun on the ground as a sign of peace. Murad agreed to the peace offer, but as Bryan turned away, he grabbed the gun to shoot him. Unbeknownst to Murad, Bryan had already removed the bullets. Seeing Murad's actions, Bryan deemed him untrustworthy and immediately killed him. 3 weeks after the incident, Bryan was seen waiting for Kim to take her driving test. Kim arrived afterward, having passed the exam perfectly and obtained her driver's license. 2 years later, a group of Russian mafia members were shown holding a man named Edo hostage. The leader of the Russian mafia was Oleg Malenkov, and he demanded that Edo to open the safe in the office, as Edo's boss owed a significant debt to him. However, when the safe was opened, it turned out to be empty, so they immediately killed Edo. The scene then shifted to Kim, who had just discovered she was pregnant due to her relationship with Jamie. At that moment, Kim also startled by Bryan's unexpected arrival, who had come with a doll as birthday present for Kim, even though her birthday was still some time away. Apparently, it was also revealed that Kim now lived with Jamie. That evening, Lenore visited Bryan at his apartment, where she came to talk about her new husband, whose behavior had recently changed, and she expressed regret for leaving Bryan in the past. The next night, Lenore's new husband, Stuart, visited Bryan's apartment. At that moment, Stuart begged Bryan to stop seeing Lenore, pointing out that they were now separated. Feeling uncomfortable, Bryan reluctantly agreed to Stuart's request. The next day, Bryan was out jogging when he received a message from Lenore, telling him that she was at his apartment and asking him to buy some bread. Knowing this, Bryan immediately went to get the bread for her. However, when Bryan arrived at his apartment, he found Lenore lying lifeless on his bed. At the same time, the police arrived to arrest Bryan, and it was clear that he had been framed. Feeling a mix of sadness and anger, Bryan tried to stay calm and figure out the situation. After that, he had to subdue the police officers attempting to arrest him and then evaded them, escaping into a warehouse after fleeing through a drain. Because of this, Bryan was a fugitive. Not long after, Bryan contacted Kim, where he informed her that her mother had died and he had been framed for the murder. Bryan then urged Kim to stay calm and strong, promising her that he would find out who was behind the murder. Meanwhile, a clever detective named Dotzler was assigned to investigate Lenore's death. At that time, He ate a piece of bread brought by Bryan and meticulously searched for even the smallest clues. Realizing that he was now a fugitive, Bryan called Sam to ask about their secret hideout because he planned to start tracking down Lenore's killers on his own. At the same time, Dotzler was interrogating Stewart, who had just returned from out of town. At that moment, Stewart appeared very sad and shocked by Lenore's death. After that, they viewed Lenore's body in the morgue, and Dotzler also asked about Lenore's ex-husband, Bryan. Hearing this, Stewart then described Bryan as a good man, but noted that he had many enemies. Stewart also mentioned that Bryan had been involved in cases in Paris and Turkey, likely linking him to his current enemies. Meanwhile, Dotzler, having found no significant leads yet, instructed his team to focus on capturing Bryan and monitoring Kim. Dotzler also ordered 2 officers to download the GPS data from Lenore's car to trace her recent movements. When the officers were about to do this, Bryan apparently was already there to download the GPS data himself. After retrieving it, Bryan discovered the last location Lenore had visited, which was a gas station far from the city. Knowing this, Bryan went there posing as a police officer to look for clues. After reviewing the CCTV footage, Bryan saw that Lenore had been abducted by a group of men the night she was killed. Suddenly, 2 of Dotzler's officers arrived and aimed their guns at him. Ignoring them, Bryan continued to search for clues and noticed that one of the kidnappers had a tattoo on his hand. After that, the officers easily apprehended Bryan. On the way, the officers proudly informed Dotzler that they had captured Bryan and boasted that he was not as tough as people said. However, Dotzler, who always cautious, told them to stop and wait for him to arrive because he believed Bryan wouldn't give up so easily. Hearing this, the officers, thinking Dotzler was overreacting, ignored his order and continued to take Bryan to the police station. As expected, Bryan produced a handcuff key he had prepared earlier. After unlocking the handcuffs, a struggle ensued as Bryan attempted to take control of the car, eventually managing to escape. After that, Bryan contacted Dotzler and he asked Dotzler to give him 2 days to uncover the truth and prove that he was not Lenore's killer. However, Dotzler replied that he would continue to pursue Bryan, as it was the role of the judge in court to determine his guilt or innocence. Hearing this, Bryan simply responded, "Good luck." Later at the police station, the officers discovered that Lenore had been kidnapped by a group of people that night, meaning Bryan was not the perpetrator. At the same time, Bryan went to his secret hideout where Sam was waiting. Apparently, Sam refused to let Bryan face his problems alone. The next day, Lenore's funeral took place, where Dotzler and his team closely monitored Kim's movements to try and capture Bryan. Sam was also present at the funeral, and he told Kim that Bryan wanted her to stick to her usual routine, as Bryan would meet her. The following day, Dotzler instructed his team to be ready, believing that Bryan would be meeting Kim. Indeed, Kim met her father in a restroom at her campus. At that moment, she told Bryan that she was pregnant, which made him even more sorrowful, thinking that Lenore would have been delighted. Kim also mentioned that Stewart had been acting strangely, as he always being accompanied by bodyguards. Shortly after, Dotzler and his team arrived, boldly entering the women's restroom. Fortunately, they did not find Bryan as he had already escaped. Realizing that Bryan was still in the area, Dotzler and his team continued their search. At that moment, Bryan set off a small explosive that triggered the campus alarm and activated the sprinklers, causing students to evacuate, allowing him to escape once again. The next day, Stewart was preparing to leave town with his bodyguards. As he traveled, Bryan was seen tailing him. However, suddenly, Bryan's car was rammed and pushed towards a cliff, resulting in the car exploding. The perpetrators were Oleg's men, and after seeing the condition of the car, they were confident that Bryan had died in the explosion and left the scene. However, Bryan managed to survive. Sometime later, Bryan flagged down a passing car to hitch a ride. When he spotted the vehicle that had attacked him stopped at a convenience store, Bryan immediately got out and entered the store. At that moment, Bryan took down Oleg's men one by one, demanding to know who had sent them. When they refused to tell him, Bryan left to find Stewart and convinced that Stewart was connected to the entire ordeal. After incapacitating Stewart, Bryan took him to an isolated location for interrogation. Under torture, Stewart finally revealed that Oleg had killed Lenore. Apparently, Stewart had a massive debt to Oleg. Because of this, Oleg had threatened to kill Stewart's family, including Lenore and Kim. Knowing Bryan's resilience, They had framed him to ensure he would be apprehended by the police. Knowing this, Bryan then took Stuart to his secret hideout, where Sam and Kim were already waiting. At that moment, Kim was furious upon learning that her mother's death was because Stuart had gotten involved with the Russian mafia. After that, Bryan asked Stuart to call Oleg and pretend to want to repay his debt. Shortly after, Oleg answered Stuart's call and asked him to come to his headquarters. Before carrying out his plan, Bryan inquired about who Oleg was, where he could be found, and how he operated. Stuart then explained that Oleg was a former Russian Special Forces soldier who had served in war zones. At some point, Oleg retired from the military and wiped out the Russian mafia to become the sole ruling mafia boss. Sometime later, they headed to Oleg's headquarters, where Stuart pretended to meet him under the pretense of their agreement. When the door opened, Bryan suddenly stepped in and subdued the guards. Posing as Stuart, Bryan then entered the building, while Stuart returned to the car. Once inside, Bryan systematically eliminated the guards. After clearing the place, Bryan entered Oleg's room, where he immediately opened fire on him. Bryan was initially overpowered, but Oleg, rather than finishing him off, decided to toy with him. However, this gave Bryan the chance to turn the tables and shoot Oleg. As Oleg lay dying, Bryan asked why he had killed Lenore and why he intended to kill Kim as well. Oleg then realized that both he and Bryan had been manipulated by Stuart, as he had sacrificed Lenore and put Kim at risk, hoping to provoke Bryan into eliminating Oleg's gang so that Stuart could escape his debts. Realizing his crime was exposed, Stuart shot Sam and kidnapped Kim. When Bryan arrived, he found Sam being taken to the hospital by Dotzler's team, who had just arrived. After that, Bryan stole a sports car to chase Stuart, who was fleeing with Kim. On the way, Dotzler contacted Bryan and informed him that the police had found ample evidence proving Bryan's innocence and that he would not face charges. Dotzler then urged Bryan not to cause trouble and to leave Stuart's capture to the police. However, Bryan retorted that while Dotzler worked for his career, he was working for his daughter. Not long after, Stuart had boarded a plane that was about to take off. Suddenly, Bryan arrived and, in a daring move, crashed his car into the plane's wheel, preventing it from taking off. Bryan then shot Stuart. Although Bryan wanted to kill Stuart, Kim stopped him, reminding him that killing Stuart would destroy the evidence and lead to his imprisonment. In the end, Bryan allowed Stuart to be taken by the police. Before leaving, Bryan promised Stuart that if he ever got out of prison, he would find him and kill him. A month later, Bryan was seen spending time with Kim and Jamie. At that moment, they also mourned the loss of the cheerful and loving Lenore, but knew they had to move forward with their lives. The film then concluded. Moral lesson from the story: if you want to be a cool dad, remember that a horse will always beat a karaoke machine, and at least it won't cause chaos in your living room. Also, always teach your daughter to use her phone. It might just save her from very unfriendly kidnappers.